It is indeed a special live broadcast with the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Mayor Christine Lagarde. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I know you've just come out of a press junket at the Reserve Bank answering several questions, one of which the main intrigue has been whether or not you're here to offer South Africa a rescue package. But more importantly for me is whether or not South Africa needs a rescue package.
Well, let me make it absolutely crystal clear. I'm not here for any kind of financing program. I've not been asked. I'm not here to negotiate anything of that sort. Added to which, if you ask me whether the country needs it, I don't see any need for a financing program. There is no balance of payment crisis, and no, I don't see the need, frankly. I'm here on a visit because I was invited by President Ramaphosa, and because I do visit my key countries on a very regular basis. That's all. But I love South Africa on the top of it.
But the IMF has obviously proffered its opinion on the state of affairs. You spoke about the need for growth-friendly fiscal austerity.
Consolidation, not austerity.
So, consolidation, but I'm curious as to whether or not you agree with the notion that whether or not we like it, due to problems that you've pointed out, like Eskom, Transnet, that we are nearing a fiscal cliff.
You know, I try to look at the external environment first. What is the current situation in the global economy? Is it safe, solid, predictable, certain? The answer to all that is probably no. So the likelihood of a difficulty ahead is very likely for all countries. And that is a result of trade tensions. That's an understatement, probably. The result of the increased cost of financing, the result of a higher dollar value, and in the mix of that you have geopolitical uncertainty. So you've got quite a few ingredients to justify that all countries actually look at their domestic situation to build their buffers, to prepare for the possible dark clouds on the horizon. And that is the discussion that I've had this morning and later on in the day with the various authorities, including with President Ramaphosa early today.
So we'll talk about the dark clouds in just a moment, but you're talking about countries insulating themselves against some of these external shocks, as you mentioned, the possible trade wars. But would you say that there are ideological differences on how to approach some of the things? I know there's been criticism against South Africa on the land policy. You were asked about that question. And South Africa would argue that there is a need, strong need for a developmental agenda as opposed to an IMF market-friendly direction. You
know, I think we have to face the reality. There are investors around the world who pick and choose the countries of destination where they're going to invest for, to build a factory, to develop activity, to create a new research and development center. And they look at the fundamentals of the economy. They're not overly concerned about ideology, but they look at the fundamentals. Is the country stable from a macroeconomic point of view? Is it likely to run into an economic or a financial crisis? Is the monetary policy predictable and well anchored? Is the banking system solid? Can I transfer my investment reasonably easily? So it's really on the basis of those parameters that they choose their destination, number one, and that the local investors will decide to stay and expand in the country in order to create growth, in order to develop jobs, and in order to address some of the issues that, frankly, South Africa has had for quite a few years, and which clearly the President seems determined to address.
You spoke about complacency, the danger of lethargy, and also that gap between expectations of delivery and the need for disruptions. I want to talk about some of what you spoke about in Ghana, the future of work, and how you forecast the markets reacting to that, generally for the region, and perhaps how we could approach it in South Africa.
All right, I'll take Sub-Saharan Africa at large. And we just conducted a a conference in Accra, Ghana, about the future of work. You have to have in mind two key numbers. The acceleration of demographics in sub-Saharan Africa. We are at about 1 billion people here in sub-Saharan Africa. In 20 years' time, it will be 1.7 billion people, of which a very large number of young people who will access the job market. So far, sub-Saharan Africa has been able to create 9 million jobs per year. If you look at the demographic changes that I have just mentioned, going from 1 billion to 1.7 billion, predominantly new young people coming and joining the workforce, it's 20 million jobs that need to be created on an annual basis to simply absorb the newcomers. So the imperative, in order to reap the benefit of those young people, to unleash their productivity and their capacity and their creativity, is to have the conditions that will help create those jobs, invest in the countries, and make sure that they have a future and see their future
According
at home.
to the IMF, what are those conditions? Because the question will then be, first of all, you've got to go into defining the future of work in this fourth industrial revolution, because it can't be business as usual, and you need to make sure that you don't leave people who've been left behind again.
You know, there's one thing that we are certain of, and that is uncertainty. And nobody today can predict what the future of work will be. Some people say, well, it will be just like the previous industrial revolution. There will be jobs gone and jobs created, and there will probably be a net positive of new jobs. Other people are terrified and say, you know, between robotization, artificial intelligence, jobs being eliminated, it will be a net negative, and there will be an army of people who will be unemployed, and the machines will replace us. I think we can work with the machines, but to do that, we need to equip our young people and the new workforce of tomorrow with the ability to adjust, to prepare, to have the capacity to move from one job to the other. And that is something that is learned through education, through constant training. Now, many people will have said that. I think it's also because policymakers will have a debate and will rely on the information of the private sector, of the entrepreneurs, of the young social entrepreneurs, and I met some earlier today at lunch, that the profiles of training and education will become a bit clearer. But I think open-mindedness is a key for that.
We'll get to the profiles in just a moment, but you also met women, women leaders in the sector, and women is something that you say from a policy change is very much needed by African governments. But what are you saying to them? What are you proposing to them to ensure that they're better empowered, they have greater access?
I'll give you two examples. One is there has to be a review of the entire legal system to make sure that there is no discrimination that is already embedded in the law, without us really necessarily knowing about it, because it can be constitution, it can be the law, it can be the soft law underneath. But that's step number one. Step number two, what are the policies that actually operate at the disadvantage of women? I can think of fiscal policies that do not necessarily take into account women. I'm thinking about maternity leaves, I'm thinking about parental leave, I'm thinking about childcare centres, I'm thinking about the proper transportation from home to work that is safe for women. I'm thinking about all the informal work that exists at the moment and which is very often discharged by women who are unaccounted for, often poorly remunerated, if at all. So it's all these, you know, I wish it was off the shelf, package ready, improve the situation of women. It's far more complicated than that, and it needs to be really looked at in details. What I can tell you, though, is that there is a stronger disadvantage for black women in general than for women at large, and there is a strong discrimination against women.
I'm glad you said that, because when you spoke about the profiles earlier on, and that's why I went to redefining the definitions of what do we mean by work, because also in the same token, there are policies in place that are not benefiting women. So there needs to be a major paradigm change in terms of the work that should then be inclusive and extended to women.
Yeah, and there's something that we have been advocating in many countries around the world. I'm not sure that South Africa has taken it up, which is called gender budgeting. And it's a set of principles and a process by which budget is prepared at the request of the finance minister or the prime minister, depending on the country. And for each and every budget line item, the finance minister will ask each and every minister, in which way does it benefit women? This is something that can produce significant changes in the way in which public money is spent. How
do you, as the IMF, then curate some of those transactions? Because we're talking about creative ideas, things that are almost new to us. They've been in the offing for the past couple of years, but they're still new to us.
Two things that I'll give you as examples. First of all, we try to, because we are the recipient of lots of practices and knowledge around the world, we try to operate as a forum where other countries can come, pick and choose. That's number one. So we are available to any member country that wants to be better informed about what, Rwanda is doing or what Sweden is doing, with a particular focus on either budget or gender budgeting, for instance. The second thing that we did recently in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Senegal, in Kenya, there's a third country where we did that, Angola. In those three countries, we conducted what we called hackathon. And the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF opened an invitation to anybody, particularly young people, but anybody, who had idea as to how to leverage digital tools to better mobilize revenue in a particular country. We had incredible ideas that came up from the grassroots, from the young people. And some of them were completely crazy, but some of them could be developed, and the Fiscal Affairs Department is working with them in order to offer them to the membership if they're interested.
Earlier on, when we were speaking about multilateralism and what is now being plurilateralism, which people say should really come to the fore, the bigger question is, does that mean the IMF foresees itself possibly even re-looking at its mandate to help facilitate some of these relationships for the better good of countries like, or continents like Africa?
When in doubt, I look at the articles that the founding fathers actually designed 75 years ago. And we have two key missions. One has to do with financial stability, and that has evolved over the course of time. The second is prosperity through trade, notably. So I think that gives us a very strong entry in assessing what will be conducive to better trade, to better regulated trade, to mutually beneficial trade. And we have seen, and we've produced now a lot of analytical work that demonstrates that trade is actually conducive to more productivity, to more innovation. And we have one downside. It's that it is not sufficiently spread, and it's not yet trade for all. It has not benefited all because it has transformed the landscape. It has transformed the supply chains, and it has excluded some people. That's an area where we collectively need to do more work.
The operative word is exclusion, and I'm glad you used that, because criticism against the IMF has been that since 2015, in terms of your reform, you've reduced the voice, the voting power of African countries. And you were asked earlier on about succession, who would you support? What kind of power?
Well, it was if somebody was asking me to step down, and I said, no, actually. I'm doing my job, and
but I think at the heart of it was, what kind of power force is the IMF looking to be, especially in some of these global debates?
What I very much hope for the institution is that we continue to be relevant for all members, not just the big boys and girls, more boys than girls for that matter, but for all countries, low-income countries, emerging market economies, advanced economies. We are not a development bank. We cannot do financing. We are the rescuer. We are the companion on that journey from dear economic circumstances to a better situation. But we are there for all members of the institution, that is 189 countries. I very much hope that over the course of time, the appropriate balancing between various members can be maintained and improved. And I hope to live to see it, even as managing director for that matter.
Actually, that's what I want to talk about, because your tenure as managing director has changed the texture of the direction of some of the policies of the IMF. And I'd imagine that a lot of it has to do with you being a woman. What are just some of the most inhibitive experiences you've had in being a woman leader and corralling such an important organization in the right direction?
If I'm very nice, I would say excessive focus by some who regard the only mission of the fund as looking at the fiscal policy, the monetary policy, and a few structural reforms, and that's it. I've taken the view that we need to have an open mind to all sorts of issues to the extent that they are macro-critical, number one. I've also taken the view that we need to work for all and be inclusive, meaning when fiscal consolidation is needed, it has to be growth-friendly, number one, and it has to be attentive to the social protection that is needed for the poorest and the most exposed. So when we do a reform that is going to remove subsidies, for instance, we first of all say, identify those who are going to take the hit and who cannot afford it. Identify those who cannot pay for their transportation bill if the grant or the subsidy on oil is going to go. So that's in that vein, I think we have changed. I summarize it with 3 words. I see the IMF myself as a wallet, a brain, and a heart. And the heart dimension sometimes has to be put forward a little bit more forcefully by me and by colleagues to the rest of the institution.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Christine Lagarde is the IMF Managing Director. Palesa and Peter, it's back to you.